Everyone knew Brian only became Helen's boyfriend because Jason went back to his home country. And everyone was waiting for the drama, a show where Brian gets ditched when Jason comes back. But nobody knew that Brian was waiting too, waiting for the day Helen would break up with him. At 5:30 p.m. at the local marriage registry, after the last couple left, an employee approached Brian, eyes filled with sympathy. "Hi there, we're about to close. The person you're waiting for hasn't arrived?" Brian clutched the marriage application form and quietly said, "Give me a moment, I'll make one last call." He pulled out his phone to call Helen. The call interface already had 12 missed calls, and this last one wasn't answered either. Brian silently closed his phone, apologized, and left the registry. As the door closed behind him, he paused. In the next instant, he ripped up the marriage form and tossed it in the trash. It was the third and final time Helen had stood him up on their wedding registration day. He loved Helen, but he wasn't a pathetic fool without self-respect. "Helen, loving you ends here." In the back of a cab, Brian checked his social feed. Right away, he saw a mutual friend posting something new. "So happy to see an old friend return. Welcome back, Jason. The future's bright." In the picture, sitting among friends, was Helen, the Helen he hadn't been able to reach all day. Right next to her was Jason, Brian's former best friend, her first love. The three of them grew up together, but Jason didn't even tell Brian he was back. Brian took a deep breath and liked the post. Before there was any reaction, his boss messaged him, "The H Airlines project is yours." Brian immediately perked up. He replied, "Got it," and looked at the cab driver. "Could you please take me to D accounting firm instead?" The H Airlines project was worth millions. Rather than go home alone, he decided to work late. By 10 p.m., the city lights were just turning on. Brian left the firm and hailed a cab home. The place was dark, completely quiet. Brian was used to scenes like this, so after freshening up, he prepared to sleep. Unexpectedly, the doorbell rang. Brian got up and opened the door, and was taken aback. Helen was there, drunk enough to lean on Jason for support. The sight stabbed Brian's heart right away. After a few seconds of silence, he managed to say, "Long time no see." "Long time indeed," Jason replied with a smile, then casually asked, "Why didn't you come to my welcome back party tonight?" Jason looked just as handsome as ever, wearing a white dress shirt with neat short hair. In his usual tone, Brian replied, "Today was actually supposed to be our wedding registration day." The air went still. Jason's eyes flickered, and he showed a sheepish expression. "Sorry about that. I must have caught up in things." "No worries, it wasn't important anyway." Brian glanced at Helen, thinking peacefully to himself that he wasn't planning to go through with the marriage anymore. He stepped back, offering space. "Do you want to come in?" Jason hesitated but politely declined. "No, I've just gotten back and have a lot to do. Helen's in your care. If she gets a headache after drinking, remember to make her some hangover tea in the morning with extra honey." He paused, gave a meaningful smile and said, "Oh, I almost forgot. You're her boyfriend now, you probably know all this." Jason's words pierced Brian. Of course, he knew. Little details about Helen had been seared into his memory during a decade-long crush. Brian didn't lose his composure, but instead smiled. It's funny how the guy who left Helen behind for a research offer abroad still remembers her likes and dislikes. Jason froze. Brian shut the door, guiding Helen to the bedroom. After wetting a towel in the bathroom, he was about to wipe Helen's face when she opened her eyes. The next moment, Helen's warm kiss fell on him. Brian tried to pull away, but Helen was too strong. In the dimly lit bedroom, two figures were inseparably tangled. Helen's voice, muddled, called out by his ear, "Jason, stop messing around." Brian froze, his heart twisting with pain. He closed his eyes, silently enduring it. When it was over, he looked over at the sleeping Helen, then shakily got up to the bathroom. His stomach burned like fire, and he lay down next to Helen, finally drifting into a restless sleep. The next morning, the alarm went off and Brian woke up, the bed empty beside him. He got up quickly to wash up and ran into Helen on her way out. She stood straight, a calm look in her eyes. "Remember, you have a follow-up at the hospital tomorrow." Brian paused, his heart tugged again. He didn't mention he'd already booked the appointment, just replied casually. All right. She didn't want his child. A secret they both understood. Frankly, he didn't want any ties with her anymore. Helen, satisfied, turned to leave but suddenly remembered. Oops, I had something come up yesterday, and I forgot our registration. We'll go again when we have time. This was the third time Brian had heard her say that. He had nothing left to say and just replied, Sure, when you have time. Helen was surprisingly calm, and it made her just glance at him without saying anything before leaving the room. When Brian arrived at the office, he immediately went to the admin manager. No need to approve my wedding leave. The admin manager looked at him in shock. What happened? Weren't you getting married? Did the wedding date change? Brian shook his head. No, I'm not getting married anymore. Seeing the shocked look on the admin manager's face, he handed over a stack of papers. Also, I've applied for a long-term position in Germany. I'm leaving next month. The admin manager was even more surprised and asked multiple times, Are you sure? You have no base in Germany. It's like starting over. Brian gave a serious smile. The senior management positions here are saturated. To move up, I have to start over. After leaving the admin manager's office, Brian returned to his own office, opened a dossier, and got to work. It was 9 p.m. when Brian finally got home. He saw Helen focused on writing something on her tablet. Her sleeves were rolled up casually, revealing her fair arms. Seeing Brian, Helen closed the tablet and looked at him calmly. Did you know Jason is back? Yeah, Brian replied steadily, looking her in the eye. He brought you home when you were drunk last night. Helen paused. She then raised an eyebrow slightly, dodging the topic, and simply said, Jason's birthday is in a few days, and he wants to invite you to his party. Brian looked at her and asked, Why is he asking you to invite me? Helen answered matter-of-factly, He's working at my research institute now. It was just convenient. Brian's lips twitched. His eyes held a trace of indescribable irony. He remembered clearly, 5 years ago when Jason went abroad, Helen vowed she'd never work with him again. Yet now, with Jason back, it's like she never said it. Not interested in digging up past issues, Brian simply said, Noted, ending the conversation. A few days later, on Jason's birthday, Helen was gone early in the morning. After getting ready, Brian headed to the closet to change. Looking at all the conservative suits, he paused. He suddenly realized that through the years, he loved so humbly, even unconsciously imitating Jason's style. Jason loved tailored suits, so Brian wore them too, although he truly preferred more stylish brands. Now that he decided to leave, he figured he'd start with how he dressed. Digging into the back of his closet, he found his old, avant-garde jacket from 5 years ago. It fit perfectly on his tall frame. Looking at his reflection, both unfamiliar and familiar, he ran a hand through his hair, exposing his forehead. At noon, Brian arrived on time at the scheduled place. As he approached the door of the private room, he heard someone sharply say, What? Jason, you invited Brian? Why? Can he even understand what we're talking about? Exactly. If not for Helen, he couldn't even get into our gathering. So Helen, now that Jason's back, just tell us. Are you choosing Jason or Brian? Brian paused. He always knew Helen's circle didn't welcome him. She was a leading young theoretical physicist, the youngest female professor in the country. Her colleagues, self-proclaimed intellectuals, always looked down on his education, believed he was inferior to Jason, and was unworthy of being with Helen. Brian never thought he was lacking compared to them, but for Helen, he endured it. But not anymore. Brian took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Seeing him, the group showed no embarrassment at being caught gossiping. Instead, they teased, Brian's here. We were just joking around. Amidst snickering, Brian smiled. It is funny. I wonder if your annual salary adds up to my monthly bonus? What makes you all so confident? The room fell silent, stunned by this previously silent man's retort. The woman who spoke earlier turned red and green. Helen looked up at Brian with a cold tone. Brian, that's not funny. Brian met her gaze. When others joked around, she ignored it. But when he replied, she spoke up. Deep down, she shared the same views as her circle. She looked down on his education, thought he wasn't as good as Jason, and believed she was settling with him. That realization hit Brian's chest like a weight, just as Jason approached, trying to smooth things over. "Oh, Brian's always been like this since he was a kid. Let's not take it to heart." Jason's words were dripping with insincerity. In the past, Brian would have argued with Jason. But since deciding to let go of Helen, he couldn't be bothered. With a chuckle, he sat down. "Yeah, seems temper runs in the family." Jason was surprised Brian didn't fight back. After a while, the chatter resumed. Someone deliberately raised their voice. "Ms. Chun, your project is a national one with millions in research funding. Unlike some people making dirty money." Brian ignored the snide remarks. He wouldn't see them again after today. But seeing Helen indifferent to it all, he felt a twinge of sadness. When the meal finally began, Jason picked up a spicy chicken wing, and Helen immediately chided, "You can't eat spicy food. Remember your stomach issues?" Helen, who was clueless about everyday life, relied on Brian for reminders. Yet she remembered Jason's preferences so well. Brian already had no appetite, and now he couldn't eat another bite. At the end of the gathering, Helen paid the bill first. As they walked out, Brian followed behind. Suddenly, he recalled how, before Jason went abroad, the three of them were always like this. When Jason left, Brian finally became Helen's boyfriend, moving from behind her to beside her. He thought things had changed, but with Jason's return, it all went back to the way it was. Outside the hotel, Helen asked Jason seriously, "Does someone pick you up?" Jason nodded, "Yes, my sister's on her way." Just then, a car pulled up outside. A kid jumped out and hugged Jason. "Uncle, happy birthday." In the next moment, when the kid saw Helen, he started to whine. "Auntie, you haven't visited me in so long." Brian was a bit taken aback. Helen instinctively glanced at Brian, but she first bent down to pat the kid's head before telling Jason, "Send me a message when you get home." Jason nodded at her and gave Brian a look. It wasn't show-offy. It seemed more like he was saying to Brian, "See, even if Helen and I haven't spoken in 5 years, our connection is still stronger than yours." After the car pulled away, Helen turned to Brian and said, "Let's go." Brian hesitated for a moment before walking alongside her. Once they got in the car, Helen explained, "I used to be close with that kid. I didn't realize Jason hadn't told him we'd broken up." Brian turned to look at her. With no light in the car, half of her face was hidden in shadow, and he couldn't make out her expression even on the visible side. Thinking about her explanation, Brian just chuckled softly. It was funny, wasn't it? The misunderstanding was with the kid. Helen could have cleared it up with one sentence, but she didn't. Now she's explaining to him instead. Wasn't that amusing? Brian turned to look out the window. Helen didn't get a response, so she glanced at him and her eyes lingered on his stylish jacket. She frowned and said, "And also, don't dress like this again. It doesn't look good." Brian's heart trembled. Was it really that he didn't look good? Or did Helen just prefer when he dressed more like Jason? Brian closed his eyes and kept quiet. When Helen saw he wasn't responding, she also went silent, staring straight ahead. When they got home, Brian went to the study. He was heading to Germany soon, so he needed to polish his German. Luckily, he had a basic understanding from before, so relearning it wasn't too hard. He didn't hide his studies from Helen, yet she never asked or seemed to care what he was up to. The next day, the first phase of the H-Airline project was officially agreed upon. Brian took the opportunity to host a party, inviting several folks from the financial world. It was a huge success, and for the first time, Brian ended up drunk at one of these parties. Richard, his buddy, frowned and said, "You guys didn't stop him? Letting him get drunk like that, what now?" Everyone looked at each other, unsure what to do. Does Brian have a girlfriend? I don't think so. Why not give that girl a chance? She likes Brian, right? Let her take him home. Richard sked and was about to offer to take Brian home himself when Brian's phone rang. The screen displayed Helen's name. Richard picked up and put it on speaker. A calm female voice came over the line. "Brian, where are you? Why aren't you home yet?" Though her tone was cold, it confirmed her identity. Brian actually had a girlfriend. Everyone was shocked. Only Richard was frowning at the cold tone and said, "Hi, I'm Brian's colleague. He's drunk. Can you come pick him up?" The line was silent for a moment. Then her voice suddenly turned frosty. "Address." Someone quickly provided it before the call ended. The colleagues were even more astonished, buzzing with chatter. In all these years, I've never heard of Brian having a girlfriend. Yeah, he's worked late so many times, and no one's ever come to pick him up. Richard looked at a very flushed Brian and sighed. When Helen arrived at the venue, Brian's intoxication had faded slightly. He was just dazed, sitting on the sofa. Helen walked up to him, and he just stared blankly at her without saying a word. Helen quickly and carefully looked him over before coldly asking, "Was it necessary? Was it necessary to drink to this point for a job?" Brian's mind was fuzzy, but he instinctively wanted to reply, "Of course it was." But sensing Helen's displeasure, he chose not to snap back. Instead, he tugged at her sleeve and mumbled, "Let's go home." Helen felt a tightness in her chest, gave a brief nod to the observant Richard, and took Brian away. Brian fell asleep in the passenger seat as soon as they were in the car. Helen glanced over absent-mindedly. She noticed he was wearing a white shirt under his coat today. Her frown relaxed. He looked much better like this, less flashy than those garish clothes. When they got home, Helen led Brian to the bathroom, intending to help him sober up, but he pulled her down by the collar. Random kisses landed on her face. Helen, flushed with desire, finally had enough and held the back of his head to kiss him back. Things finally calmed down. Brian lay face down on the bed, his mind clear but body too drained to move. Helen leisurely emerged from the bathroom, looking unusually gentle. Suddenly, her phone rang. Seeing Jason's number, she immediately answered. Jason's anxious voice came through. "Helen, I accidentally set the pan on fire when I was cooking. It's burning. What should I do?" Helen's face changed instantly. "I'm coming right over." Hanging up, she went to change, and seeing Brian watching her, she reflexively gave an excuse. "The lab has an emergency. I need to step out. No need to wait for me tonight." Not checking his reaction, she quickly dressed and left. With the sound of her departing, the house grew cold again. Brian said nothing, closing his eyes in discomfort. They had just been intimate, the warmth not even gone, and she was rushing to another man. He didn't know how long it had been when his phone rang. It was Jason. Brian suddenly had a feeling this was Jason's power play. He listened to the ringing before finally picking up. Jason's emotional voice came through. "Helen, let's get back together. You still love me, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have come to me right after leaving Brian." Brian stopped breathing for a moment. He unintentionally tightened his grip on the phone. Helen's raspy voice was clear and came through. "Yes, I still love you." In the next instant, the call ended. The cold glow of the screen highlighted Brian's pale face. At that moment, Brian didn't know if he was more upset that one call from Jason was enough for Helen to leave him, or for the fact that despite Jason choosing his future over her again and again, Helen kept forgiving him. Lying in bed, Brian recalled a memory he thought he'd forgotten long ago. It was the first year Jason went abroad. Helen had won her first big award in physics. Brian happily took flowers to surprise her backstage at the awards, but overheard her talking with a classmate. "Your project with Jason won the award. Aren't you going abroad to get him back? Don't tell me you're actually planning to stay with Brian. Brian's not good enough for you besides his looks." Helen paused for a long time before responding, "I'll think about it." The next day, she lied to Brian, saying, "I'm going abroad for an academic conference. I'll be back in a week." Even though Brian was already Helen's boyfriend, he didn't dare ask directly, "Are you going to see Jason?" He was afraid to ask, fearing that if he did, he'd end up single. All Brian could do was say with red-rimmed eyes, "I'll wait for you to come back." Brian held out for a week and finally saw Helen return. That day, Helen, who never drank, was completely drunk. She leaned on Brian's shoulder, slurring, "Brian, from now on it's just going to be the two of us. You won't leave me, right?" Brian remembered how his heart ached back then. Holding Helen as he promised, "I won't leave you." Once those words left his mouth, he stuck by them for 5 years. Brian always thought he could endure until things got better, but he didn't expect he would tire out before that time came. At this moment, Brian's eyes were slightly red, and he finally sighed. "Helen, I'm sorry. I have to break my promise." He was going to leave her. He no longer wanted her love. The next morning, Brian went to the office. He found out the leaders from Germany were visiting that day. After their evaluation, they spontaneously decided to visit a local museum. Brian, as an employee about to go to Germany, had to tag along. After a few hours, he was a bit tired, so he sat down in the rest area. Suddenly, a bottle of water was handed to him. He looked up, startled to see it was Helen. He thought he was hallucinating. Helen opened the water and helped him take a few sips before he caught his breath enough to ask, "Why are you here?" Helen didn't answer but instead introduced Brian to the woman next to her. "This is my boyfriend, Brian." Then she introduced the woman to Brian. "This is the new researcher, Karina." Brian reached out his hand, smiling politely. "Nice to meet you." Karina shook his hand, beaming, "Wow, your boyfriend is so handsome. What a catch for you. By the way, where does your boyfriend work?" Helen hesitated for a moment, then vaguely said, "At a small office." Brian raised a brow at that. He knew well enough that Helen didn't even know where he worked. They'd been together for 5 years, he hadn't changed jobs. But did it matter to Helen? So Brian filled in the details himself. "I work at a firm called D." Karina was surprised, playfully slapping Helen's arm. "You humble much? That's one of the top 4 firms in the world. If that's small, there's no big firm around here." Helen paused and looked at Brian with a complicated expression, staying silent. Karina didn't think much of it, saying, "I'll head to the front. Catch up soon." Helen nodded as Karina left. Alone with Helen, they walked slowly. Helen's face was tense, lost in thought. Brian sighed and spoke plainly, "I work at D firm as a fund manager, handling fund investments and management." Helen lowered her eyelashes, avoiding his gaze. "Why are you telling me this?" Brian responded calmly, "Next time you can tell people that instead of just saying I'm your boyfriend and that's it." He's not just Helen's boyfriend. He has his own identity. Helen frowned, her tone somewhat annoyed. "Our work fields are totally different. How would I know about some D firm?" Brian paused briefly, then lightly chuckled with a sense of realization. "Yeah, we really are from 2 different worlds." The smile faded quickly, and he looked ahead where his boss waved at him. "All right, let's drop it. I've got to go talk to my boss." Brian picked up his pace and walked ahead. Once next to his boss, the boss looked pointedly at Helen behind him and asked, "Your girlfriend?" Brian nodded, "Yes." The boss jokingly asked, "You okay with going to Germany alone? Not bringing her?" At that moment, Helen joined his side, calmly gazing at the exhibit. Her profile was just as defined as before. Brian chuckled softly, turning his gaze away first. He knew Helen didn't speak German, so in front of her, he confidently responded in German, "I'm okay with it." After wrapping up the socializing, Brian saw the managers off. Turning around, he only saw Karina, who pointed to a store. Helen went to get water. Brian nodded. Karina, being chatty, naturally started talking. "I'm here mainly for the opening test of the Deep Space Science Art Museum, a branch of the City Star Observatory. Your girlfriend has been working on this project for 5 years. It's opening tomorrow. You're coming, right?" Brian remembered seeing Helen visit the Star Observatory website before and didn't think much. Simply said, "She didn't mention it to me. Besides, I have a meeting tomorrow afternoon. Can't miss it." Karina was surprised and immediately pulled out a ticket from her bag, boldly saying, "Oh, she might have forgotten. You're her boyfriend. How can you not come?" Brian took the ticket, his expression unreadable. When Helen returned, she handed him a bottle of water, asking casually, "What did Karina say to you?" Brian instinctively shook his head. "Nothing much." Early the next morning, Brian sat on the sofa watching Helen as she bustled around from the moment she got up. She pulled out a couture dress she usually wears only to big events and got herself ready as if she were heading to a wedding. "I've got something today," I might be back late. Helen finally remembered to tell him just as she was about to head out the door. It was obvious she had no intention of inviting him to whatever opening ceremony she was off to. Brian felt a little pinch in his chest, but he replied calmly, "All right, good luck with the opening today." Helen was taken aback for a second. "How did you know?" she started to ask, but her phone rang before she could finish. She glanced at it and quickly forgot about him, answering warmly, "You're here already? I was planning to come to get you." Jason's clear voice came through the phone, though Brian couldn't quite catch the words. The front door closed, cutting off the last bit of sound. Brian took a ticket out of his bag and looked at it for a while. Eventually, he called his assistant, "Push back my afternoon meeting, I can't make it." At 2 p.m., Brian walked into the Starry Sky Museum. It had been 5 years since his last visit. The last time he was here, it was to witness Helen confess her feelings to Jason at the old observatory. Back then, Brian stood among the crowd, knowing he had arranged that entire scene for her confession. And today, is there a main character for this grand opening? The ceremony had already started when Brian found a spot to stand. Once the lights hit the stage, Helen walked up. She carried herself with such poise and confidence that a few of the women in the audience began whispering. Helen took the microphone and spoke fluently. "This deep space-themed science art museum is a joint project of our deep space exploration lab. It's taken me 5 years to complete this." Saying this, her gaze drifted to Jason in the audience, her tone suddenly softer and more magnetic. "I once promised someone we'd explore the universe together. We lost 5 years, and this museum is a reunion gift to him. Jason, thank you for coming today." The audience erupted into applause, deeply touched by her words. Everyone except Brian, who stood dumbfounded among the cheering crowd, watching Helen pull Jason on stage and hug him under the spotlight. Unable to watch any longer, he turned away, only to come face to face with Karina, whose face was full of awkwardness. Karina glanced at the couple still hugging on stage, then back at Brian, opening her mouth to say something, but Brian walked past her calmly as if he'd never been there. He left the museum and returned to his office. In hindsight, he should have stayed for the meeting. Once work ended, Brian drove home. As soon as he parked the car, he saw Helen and Jason walking under the dim street lights in the neighborhood below, looking every bit like a couple. Oh right, Brian remembered. Helen had helped Jason find a place after he returned to the country, right next to their building. Brian walked closer and eavesdropped on their conversation. Jason shyly said, "Thanks for the gift, I really like it." Helen's voice was gentle. "I'm glad you do." They slowly walked to their building, and as they said goodbye, Helen watched him walk in. Jason hesitated, biting his lip. "It's so late. It's really sweet of you to walk me home. Brian would probably be upset if he found out." Helen frowned slightly. Just as Jason was feeling smug, Brian's cold voice rang from behind. "I don't mind." Brian emerged from the tree shadows, looking at Jason with an indifferent gaze. "We're just friends, right? Walking each other home isn't a big deal, is it?" Jason's face flushed from red to blue, barely able to muster a smile. "Yeah, I suppose I was overthinking it." Brian finally glanced at Helen and then walked past them. Soon, Helen caught up, silent, without a word of explanation. As soon as Brian got home, Richard texted him, "We're planning a farewell party for you this Friday. No excuses, you gotta come." Brian chuckled at that. He looked at Helen and calmly asked, "This Friday, I'm going to a party, wanna come?" Helen was taken aback, surprised that Brian was actually inviting her to something. His eyes were calm as ever, stirring something in her, and she reflexively agreed, "Sure, I'll be there." On the day of the party, Brian arrived on time as soon as work ended. His friends gathered around him reluctantly. "You're moving to Germany. It'll be tough to meet up again. We're gonna miss you." Brian smiled genuinely, hugging them back. "No worries, once I make it big in Germany, I'll bring you all over and take care of you." His friend finally broke into a smile through the tears. Richard kept glancing toward the entrance. "Didn't you say your girlfriend's coming too? Where is she?" Just as Brian was about to answer, he heard Helen's voice behind him. "We're not late, are we?" Brian turned to see Helen had indeed shown up, but with Jason alongside her. Everyone was taken aback by this. Unfazed, Helen explained, "Jason heard about the party and wanted to join. You don't mind, do you?" Brian forced a smile. Of course he minded, but since Jason was already there, what could he do? Throw him out? "Come on in, make yourselves at home," was all he could manage. The farewell dinner ended up being awkward beyond belief. Helen, right in front of all of his friends, would dish out food for Jason, saying, "Here, your favorite pork ribs with potatoes." Richard couldn't hold back a cold snort. "Helen, maybe you could also serve your boyfriend his favorite since he can't seem to get any." Helen froze, unsure of what to do. Brian understood then. She didn't even know what he liked. "It's fine, I'll help myself," he said with an awkward laugh, turning the lazy Susan in front of him. The dinner ended under this inexplicable tension. Richard, still unsatisfied, suggested, "How about we head to the board game place next door and play some werewolf?" Brian was taken aback. He knew Richard was trying to help him regain some ground, but he was planning to break up with Helen tomorrow. He was about to decline, but then saw Helen nodding her head. So the group headed to the game spot. Richard volunteered to be the game master. After handing out the roll cards, everyone closed their eyes. The game moved fast, and things started to become clearer after a few rounds. There were 2 wolves, and Helen, the seer, successfully identified the first one. Only 1 wolf remained. Brian, as the witch, revealed his identity and managed to stay alive until the final round with his antidote. Whether by chance or fate, it came down to the 3 of them. Brian, Helen, and Jason, who was obviously the remaining werewolf. Brian looked at Helen and said, "You checked my identity. If we both vote for Jason, we can win this." Jason, knowing he was exposed, didn't even bother to argue but instead pleaded, "Helen, I'm really not the werewolf. Just trust me this once. Okay?" Richard rolled his eyes. "All right, let's vote." Brian and Jason pointed at each other, then looked at Helen. Helen paused for a moment, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze. She said firmly, "I vote Brian is the wolf." Brian was stunned. He hadn't processed it when his friend coldly chuckled. "Seriously? What's the point of playing if we're just going to vote based on who's cutest?" Jason's eyes glistened with tears quickly. He looked pitiable and then addressed the group. "I don't know what I did wrong to be targeted like this. If you guys don't want to play with me, then I'll leave." He darted out the door. Helen immediately stood up, looking at Brian coldly. "It's just a game. Why take it so seriously?" After saying that, she went after Jason. Brian instinctively grabbed her arm. "Don't go." With everyone around being his friends, if Helen just left like that, how awkward would that be for him? Helen's eyes flickered, clearly realizing the same. But ultimately, she broke free of his grasp, politely saying, "I'll cover this. Enjoy." Then, without hesitation, she turned and left. She chose to abandon him and went after Jason. Brian watched Helen's retreating figure, feeling a deep sense of sadness. Everyone fell silent. Richard looked apologetic. "I'm really sorry, Brian. I didn't expect it to end up like this." Brian snapped back to reality, forcing a smile. "It's okay. I know you guys had my back. But today's supposed to be my farewell, and without them we can speak more freely, right?" Under the light, his eyes were shockingly red. Yet he smiled and raised his glass. "Come on. Cheer up. Me leaving is a good thing. You guys need to wish me well, like wish me..." He paused for thought before continuing with tears welling up. "Wish me success. Wish me all the best." Everyone exchanged a look, subtly tearing up too. They raised their glasses for a toast, clinking them loudly. "To you, success. May all your wishes come true." After the gathering, Brian got the notification for the plane ticket his company had booked for him. "Dear Mr. Brian, your flight 7399 is scheduled to depart on January 24th, 2025, at 5:20 p.m. Safe travels." That's the day after tomorrow. January 24th, the day he officially leaves Helen. Brian tried not to dwell on it, throwing himself into packing. While he was busy, Helen came home. She didn't bring up the incident at the game place, and Brian didn't ask. Even though she clearly saw him packing, she didn't react. You do your thing. I'm going to sleep. Maybe she was confident Brian wouldn't leave her, or she just didn't care if he did. While packing, Brian stumbled upon 2 forgotten theater ticket vouchers at the bottom of a bag. He remembered winning them in a raffle months ago with Helen outside the theater. They'd planned to see a play together. But when Jason came back, no one remembered about them. Brian held up the tickets and called to Helen. Let's use these tomorrow. Helen casually agreed, sure. Brian put them in a visible spot on the table. Once they see that play, there will truly be nothing left between them. The next day, Brian and Helen went to the theater to see a play based on Eileen Chang's classic, Red Rose and White Rose. The most iconic scene of the play is the male lead's confession. He says, "Every man has 2 women. Marry the red rose and it becomes a mosquito bloodstain on the wall, while the white rose becomes the bright moonlight before the bed. Marry the white rose and it becomes a grain of rice stain on clothes, while the red is the cinnabar mole on the heart." Brian was captivated by this scene, and his eyes even got a little misty. He couldn't help but relate it to himself. This scenario isn't something women can escape either. Jason is the white moonlight in Helen's life, dazzling and charming, and Brian found himself glancing at Helen. But in the dim theater, she was engrossed in replying to messages on her phone. The screen showed Jason's name, stabbing at Brian's heart. "What are you doing? I'm so bored. Can you come over and keep me company?" "Hold on, I'll be there soon." Helen quickly replied and then, sensing something, looked up to see Brian's calm face. She asked, puzzled, "What's wrong? Is the play not good?" Brian shook his head and just said, "It's nothing." He turned back to the stage, thinking that he might not even be the grain of rice. Brian's heart ached, feeling both ridiculous and sad. After the play ended, they followed the crowd to the theater entrance. Brian knew the reason Helen was in such a rush was to meet Jason, but he couldn't help himself from speaking up. "Let's go home for dinner. I bought a bunch of your favorite foods." But Helen cut him off without hesitation. "No, I have something later. It's just a meal, it won't take you long." Brian tried to persuade her, wanting just one last meal to put an end to their relationship. But Helen wasn't interested. Her eyes were cold and indifferent, just like any other ordinary day in the past 5 years. She said, "Next time, when I'm free, I'll definitely accompany you." At that moment, Brian finally felt relieved. He said goodbye to her as usual. "All right, I got it." He watched Helen turn away, eager to catch a taxi and vanish from sight. Then he whispered softly, "There won't be a next time, Helen." When he got home, the arranged pickup was right on time at the door. He sent all the clothes he couldn't take to Germany back to his parents' house. He also cleared out their photos and couple items, throwing them in the trash. Before leaving, he left a parting gift for Helen in the form of sticky notes. He stuck one on the fridge. "Vegetables are best eaten within 3 days, and I left your beef in the freezer. Remember to thaw it before eating." He put another one on the washing machine. "Your wool sweater and suits can't go in the washer. You need to take them to the dry cleaners, and don't mix different colors." On the balcony, he stuck one. "The plants on the windowsill need watering at least once a week, or they'll dry out." By the time he stopped writing, the room was covered in yellow sticky notes. Brian stood there, staring. These 5 years were marked by these notes, symbolizing his love for her. Helen regarded his love like the sticky notes too, looked at, then tossed aside. And now it was the last time he'd love her. There was one sticky note left, and Brian wrote one final message. "Helen, happy breakup." He put it on Helen's tablet. Everything was over. Brian picked up his suitcase and walked out of the home he'd lived in for 5 years. With a click, the door latched, leaving nothing behind. Helen should have been clueless about the loss, but she had a habit of installing surveillance at home. She instinctively wanted to check on Brian at home, but as soon as she opened the surveillance app, the breakup words hit her eyes. Instantly, her whole body froze as if struck by lightning, leaving nothing but emptiness. Jason was sitting right there. He used the excuse of a lab issue to invite her over, but now seeing Helen so absent-minded and uneasy made him even more uneasy. He could only ask, "Did something happen?" Helen didn't explain, She just abruptly got up to leave. But there was a clear panic on her face, a look Jason hadn't seen in 10 years. Let's stop here today. For the next steps, you can handle it with your ability. Jason had this gut feeling that it was related to Brian. He didn't want to lose to him, so he called out, "Is something up with Brian? He can handle it. You don't need to rush like this." Previously, Helen might have sat back down. But now, just seeing that text made her lose her cool. How could she sit comfortably now? No need. This time, Helen didn't say more. She grabbed her coat by the lab door and left. Jason, unable to stop her, got visibly upset. After a while, he made a call. "Can you help me check something out?" Helen kept trying to call Brian after she left, but his phone was out of service. Her expression seemed unchanged, but anyone who knew her would notice her lips tightly pressed and her hands clenched. She was showing a kind of panic she had never felt before. This panic fully exploded when she got home. Helen stared blankly at the home she shared with Brian. The place felt empty, yet was scattered with yellow sticky notes. The sunset cast a harsh golden light on the notes through the balcony. She opened her mouth to call his name but knew it was pointless. He was already gone. All that was left were these little notes. She looked at each one, and bit by bit her rationality melted away. Her heart tightened in a way worse than when she heard Jason was moving abroad. For the first time, Helen felt something slipping out of her control. Suddenly, a thought struck her. Helen remembered Brian once mentioned the D law firm. She quickly Googled the address and hurried over. But without an appointment, she was stopped at the front desk. "I'm Brian's girlfriend. I need to see him. Can you reach out to him?" Sweat formed in Helen's palm as she spoke, holding her breath. The receptionist glanced at her suspiciously. "You're Brian's girlfriend and need me to reach him?" Helen was at a loss for words. As things got awkward, Brian's boss, whom she had met briefly on the Great Wall, showed up. He tapped her shoulder, signaling her to follow him. Helen followed, eager to ask, "Do you remember? We met before." The boss obviously remembered, but he also remembered Brian's demeanor back then. So now he just smiled and said, "You won't find him at the office." "What?" Helen was stunned. She quickly asked, "Where did he go?" "He's gone abroad and won't be back," the boss said without hesitation. Helen stood frozen, barely squeezing out the words. "Abroad?" The boss nodded, calm as ever, but his words hit her like a bullet, piercing her heart. "You didn't know? He applied for a position in Germany a month ago." Helen's face fell instantly. A month ago? Wasn't that when Jason came back? So from the moment Jason returned, Brian had planned to leave her? Understanding this, Helen felt something indescribable weighing on her chest, suffocating her. He didn't mention it. She spoke half a sentence, meeting the boss's gaze that seemed to watch the drama unfold, and got a bit angry. "I see, thank you," she said stiffly and walked away. The boss watched for a moment before reluctantly turning away. He then texted Brian, "Your girlfriend came to the office. She might be heading to Germany to find you." He knew Brian was on the plane and couldn't reply. So, half curious, he set it aside and left as if nothing happened. Meanwhile, back at home, Helen was filled with rage. Whether it was the curious looks from others or the fact that Brian parted ways without a word, she felt upset. Seeing the room filled with sticky notes fueled her growing anger. "Writing these to ease your guilt? Brian, I won't let you just end things one-sidedly." Helen tore down the notes and crumpled them in her hand. The rough paper hurt her palm, but she couldn't let go. She tossed them into the trash in frustration, out of sight. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Helen grabbed it, but it wasn't Brian. Disappointment flashed in her, but she quickly answered the call. "I found Brian's flight details and a temporary address in Germany. It's just..." Helen felt a surge of joy. "Thanks. I'll treat you when I get back." She was about to book a flight when her friend hesitantly asked, "I have to ask, what's your plan now? Jason's back and Brian chose to part ways. Isn't this your chance? Why chase him?" Her friend's voice grew serious. "Could it be you fell for him?" Helen's eyebrow twitched. A strange feeling flickered inside her, but it left too fast for her to grasp. So, she pushed it down. Calmly, she replied, "No, I just want to ask him for a clear reason. Even if we're breaking up, there has to be a reason. Am I, Helen, someone who can be tossed aside that easily?" Caught up in her situation, Helen didn't notice it, but her friend, listening, picked up on the dissatisfaction and anger in her tone. Even when Jason left her back then, she wasn't this upset. But now wasn't the time to go into detail, so she just vaguely said, "Got it. You go ahead, I won't bother you." After hanging up, she thought for a moment and called someone else. As soon as the call connected, her friend's expression turned stern. "Jason, I need to talk to you about something." Helen booked a ticket and rushed to the airport. On her way, someone from the lab called, "Helen, we're at the final stage of our project. What's with you taking time off suddenly?" Helen gripped the steering wheel, her tone calm but firm. "I have something to take care of, it won't take long. If everything goes smoothly, I'll be back by tomorrow." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then, in a serious tone, they said, "Jason came back home to develop because of you. I can't believe you haven't noticed his feelings these past days." Helen felt a twinge of irritation. Her tone started getting a bit unfriendly. "That's my business." Meaning she had to go no matter what. "All right, in that case, I have nothing more to say." With a click, the call ended. Helen frowned slightly. She realized how much her social circle rejected Brian, to the point where they could speak so bluntly. How biased. What were they saying and doing behind her back with him? Clenching her teeth, she slammed the gas pedal. At the international airport, tourists spoke different languages from all over the world, switching flights and heading to different destinations. Took Helen a while to find her gate. Sitting in the departure lounge, she felt a bit nervous. Her mind wandered, imagining what it would be like in a few hours facing Brian in Germany. She definitely needed to ask him why. Even if it was a breakup, why not do it face to face? Especially since they've been stable for 5 years with almost no fights. Why end it now? If it had to do with Jason, it was troubling. She knew she still had some lingering feelings for him too. But wasn't Brian the one who promised to always stay by her side? Only 5 years in, and now he wasn't keeping his word? Helen barely noticed that her thoughts had shifted from anger to thinking about how to win him back. Suddenly, her phone rang loudly, startling her. Instinctively, she hung up. After taking a moment, the call came again, and she hesitated before answering. "Are you calling to convince me too?" Helen sounded unexpectedly weary, but Jason's tone remained gentle, as if nothing was a big deal. Helen used to think his demeanor was perfect for her, but now she found it strangely irritating. "Helen, I'm not here to convince you. I'm here to tell you the truth. Don't you want to know why he suddenly broke up with you?" Helen tightened her grip on the phone. With difficulty, she asked, "Why?" Jason chuckled, a hint of meaning behind it. "Because he chose his career over you. Helen, this opportunity to go to Germany is important for him. Once abroad for a bit, he'll be made the main person in charge when he returns. Why would you want to hold him back?" Jason's words hit Helen hard, destroying her illusions. She opened her mouth to deny him, but then remembered what her leader had said. He applied to be sent to Germany a month ago. So, it wasn't because Jason returned that he decided to leave her. He had already decided to give her up, and Jason's return just coincidentally aligned. With that realization, Helen shut her eyes in discomfort. An overwhelming wave of anger swept over her. She ended the call stiffly, sitting in the airport like a soulless statue, unmoving, until the airport announced, "The boarding gate will close in 15 minutes. Please prepare to board." It snapped Helen out of her daze. At that moment, her ticket felt like a joke. With a mocking smile, she picked up her luggage and headed toward the service desk, a cold aura surrounding her. "Hi, I'd like to cancel my ticket, please." After a flight lasting over 10 hours, Brian felt a bit weak in the knees the moment he got off the plane. Luckily, the head of the German branch was waiting for him right at the gate. She was efficient, picking him up and driving him to his dorm. The company is still in its early stages here, so you gotta understand, the dorms won't be as nice as back home. She chatted with him while driving. "Hi, I'm Gina." Brian nodded, stealing a few more glances at her. She wore a camel trench coat, which made her look tall and elegant. Right now, she was driving with one hand, while the wind blew in through a half-open window, tousling her hair in a carefree way. Gina caught his eye in the rearview mirror and smiled mysteriously. "What are you looking at?" Brian felt a bit flustered by her smile and looked away first. "Oh, nothing." He wasn't used to interacting with such confident and straightforward women. Back home, even the most accomplished women kept a facade of humility, sometimes to the point of being fake. So there was a slight novelty in his heart, which quickly faded. When they arrived at the dorm, Gina helped him with his luggage and checked all the utilities and furniture before saying goodbye. "If anything happens, you can find me at 304. That's where I live." Gina placed the keys down and reminded him, "Remember to check the peephole before opening the door. You're new, and there are quite a few people on this floor who will be curious about you." Brian nodded obediently. Only then did Gina leave, closing the door behind her. Once alone, Brian let out a sigh of relief. Even knowing she was sent by the firm, being alone with her still made him a bit uncomfortable. Now that she was gone, he finally had a moment to really look around the room where he'd be staying for the next few years. Compared to his old place, this was more like a hotel room. 40 square meters with the basic furniture and not much else. But Brian just collapsed onto the bed, visibly tired. Now, at last, he had time to check his phone, logging onto the internet to see a message from his boss. He went silent instantly. Helen was coming to find him? Brian doubted it could be true. He didn't believe it deep down, yet couldn't help but feel an odd anticipation. A night passed. Another night passed. 48 hours later, while lying on the bed, Brian chuckled self-deprecatingly. Why was he still lying to himself at this point? Feeling a wave of sadness, he was about to fall asleep when his phone buzzed in his hand. He opened it to see Jason had posted something new. "After everything, you're still by my side." The photo was a close-up of hands intertwined. Brian instantly recognized that hand as Helen's. At that moment, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. The rising emotions welled up inside him, making it hard to breathe. He'd prepared himself for the possibility of Helen and Jason being together after he left, but he never thought it would happen just 3 days after he was gone. The photo was like taking a bullet to the heart. Brian lay on his bed, covering his eyes with his arm, seeing nothing but darkness. Eventually, a tear slid silently down his face. He really didn't want to cry over Helen anymore, but he couldn't help remembering the past 5 years. He'd done things for her he didn't even like, just to help her move on from Jason. She would want to study in the library during the winter, so he'd get up early to save her a spot. Winter always felt desolate, and even bundled in thick winter clothes, he still felt the cold. When he heard that Helen's lab needed funding, despite their impressive degrees, those investors couldn't help but speak critically. So he'd go ahead and smooth things over, never telling her about it. He thought loving her meant doing these things for her. If he told her, she might feel obligated to him out of gratitude, rather than love. All he wanted was Helen's love, not her thanks. Yet despite everything, he didn't get her love, or even gratitude. A sharp pang hit Brian's nose, and the overwhelming feelings dragged him into a dark place. "This is the last time, Brian. This is the last time you'll cry over Helen." 3 years later. Today, Brian wore a camel coat. His slightly curly hair rested on his forehead, and his tall frame drew everyone's attention the moment he appeared. He ignored all the stares and walked confidently into his boss's office. Inside sat the head of the German branch. Seeing Brian, his stern face relaxed into a slight smile. "You're here?" Brian nodded, finding a seat. "How's the application?" The boss broke into a warm smile, fetching a document from the cabinet. "All set. Your transfer back home is officially approved. Leaving in 3 days. Once back, you'll be taking the number 2 spot over there. How about that? Consider it a promotion." Brian finally cracked a small smile. He stepped up, took the document, double-checked it, and visibly relaxed. "I spent 3 years turning this place around. You'd better promote me to keep me around." He joked lightly. The boss chuckled, said a few more words, and let him go. When Brian stepped out, he ran into Gina. "How'd it go?" Brian raised the document in his hand, heading home. He smiled warmly, with a hint of longing in his eyes. Gina was genuinely happy for him, yet she couldn't deny a touch of sadness. "So we won't see each other anymore?" Brian patted her on the shoulder, joking, "It's fine, you can come work over there. I'll be your tour guide, for free, of course." He said it casually, not with much sincerity. After all, Gina's family is in Germany. But now, she's seriously considering it, then nods. "Okay." Brian doesn't think too much about it and turns to leave. Only Gina remains standing there, fixedly watching him. 3 days later, Brian lands safely. He wears sunglasses and calmly walks forward. Behind him, a woman in a black coat brushes past. The distance between them is just 5 meters. Helen suddenly stops. Her expression shows a moment of surprise. Then, she quickly turns around. People are bustling back and forth, each with their own destinations. But that familiar figure is nowhere to be found. Helen looks around, feelings she can't quite name bubbling up inside her. "Helen, what's up?" A colleague looks at her curiously. Helen shakes her head, gathering her emotions, and says flatly, "Nothing. I made a mistake." With that, she walks forward calmly again. Until she sits on the plane, her heart still feels a strange kind of unrest. After 3 years, why is she thinking about Brian again? Wasn't the pain he caused enough? Helen closes her eyes, hiding all her feelings. 3 years ago, Brian chose his career over her and broke up with her. She didn't chase after him nor said anything, accepting their breakup quietly. She thought it would be like her breakup with Jason, hard for a few days and then it's over. But a week after the breakup, she still thought of him. A month later, she still thought of him. Eating made her miss his cooking. Waking up made her miss seeing him beside her. Mixing black and white clothes, she missed his nagging. Her life, unknowingly, was filled with his presence. But Brian abandoned her. Helen thought she should have some dignity, so she resisted looking for him. But the longing got heavier, almost crushing her. That's when she realized, maybe she fell for him. But by then, he was long gone. Helen suddenly opens her eyes, feeling a tightness in her chest. She looks out the window, taking in the city, knowing he's not in it. On Brian's 3rd day back, he officially joins D-Firm. The same boss from before, and they still work together well. But looking at the contract in front of him, Brian goes silent. The boss sighs, ready to pull it back. "I know you don't want to be involved with Helen again, but her team is the only one qualified for this case. If you're really having trouble, I can send someone else." Brian frowns, holding the contract with one hand. "No need, since I chose to come back. I'm ready to face her." Seeing the boss's serious face, Brian actually smiles. "When's the meeting set?" "Tomorrow afternoon at 3, the boss quickly replies. Brian nods and leaves. He doesn't hesitate but accepts it easily. They'd meet eventually. If he hides, she'd probably think less of him. Besides, she has someone new now. They might both be married by now. Why should he care? Brian reassures himself, pushing back his emotions. The next day, he arrives at the venue, takes a deep breath at the door, and walks in. His heart feels like it's about to leap out of his chest. He looks around nervously but doesn't see Helen, just unfamiliar faces. Someone approaches with a warm smile. "I'm the person in charge of this section. You can call me Sam." Sam seems about 25 or 26, but speaks and acts with a maturity beyond his years. Brian doesn't say much, just smiles and takes his seat. As soon as he's seated, he hears Sam say, "Our boss will be here shortly. Please be patient." "No problem." Brian's palms are already sweaty. Just as he finishes speaking, the door behind him opens. Sam immediately stands and goes to greet Professor. Brian freezes, but the voice behind him isn't Helen's. "Are you the representative from D-Firm?" Brian stares blankly at the newcomer's face, a completely unfamiliar one. The weight in his heart suddenly drops, leaving unspoken disappointment. "I am. Hi, I'm Brian." He extends his hand warmly. The newcomer quickly shakes it, explaining, "Sorry, Helen went abroad a few days ago and hasn't returned." Today I'll be handling everything on her behalf. Brian has no objections, guiding them to the table and proceeding smoothly with their discussion. But inside, he's in turmoil. Did Helen really go abroad? Or is she avoiding him? After all the basic details were nailed down, he finally got the signed contract. The other guy then smiled and said, "The issues are settled, so we can finally sit down and chat, right?" Brian was taken aback. He studied the guy's face and then uncertainly asked, "Are you Karina?" Karina nodded vigorously, her facial muscles relaxing. "I thought you were mad at me, pretending not to recognize me." Brian chuckled helplessly. "Sorry, it's been so long that I hardly remember. And you didn't introduce yourself earlier." Karina looked a bit helpless too and took a moment before saying, "Remember I invited you to that opening ceremony? And then I heard you broke up with Helen a few days later, so..." She trailed off, but Brian got it instantly. She thought she was somehow indirectly responsible for their breakup, and that made her uneasy. Brian laughed softly and reassured, "It's got nothing to do with you. Even without you, I would have broken up with Helen in a few days." Karina was caught off guard, opened her mouth to say something, but ended up silent. Brian didn't dwell on it, and he started walking out first. Sam, who overheard such a big secret, was shocked, pupils dilating as he followed Karina and asked, "Is that the professor's ex-boyfriend?" "Brian?" Karina nodded in confirmation. Sam clicked his tongue in wonder. "I wondered how someone like our professor could be love-struck. Turns out it was for such a handsome guy." Even Karina was momentarily lost in thought. Yeah, she never expected someone like Helen, who would talk about Brian all night when drunk, and act like nothing happened to the point of normal work routine the next day after having angered Jason. For 3 years, Helen hasn't been with any man. Is she still waiting for him? That thought lit up in Karina's mind, and she quickly caught up with him. Brian was stopped at the door by her, giving her a puzzled look. "Is there something else?" Karina was a bit out of breath, more due to nerves. Helen's been single all these years. The sudden statement took Brian off guard. He instinctively asked, "She didn't get together with Jason?" Karina frowned and questioned back, "Why would she be with Jason? Not long after you guys split, Jason went abroad. As far as I know, they were always clean." Brian couldn't help but frown. He remembered that photo Jason had posted back then. Did Helen split with him again? Or did Jason dump her? Brian found himself overthinking, but quickly snapped out of it, chastising himself mentally. No matter who Helen was with now, it wasn't his concern. That realization made Brian's expression turn cold. Helen's life is none of my business anymore. Whether she's with Jason or not, that's her choice. I don't care. He said this calmly, noticing Karina's face changing drastically. He didn't give it much thought. A slight nod, he turned to leave, and then he came face to face with a cold woman. 3 years apart, and there was Helen. Brian's pupils constricted. Any words he wanted to say froze in his throat. 3 years apart, and seeing Helen now, it felt strangely familiar, like he never really forgot her. Acknowledging this, a bitter smile crept on Brian's face. Seems like he hadn't moved on. But either way, these weren't emotions to show now. "Long time no see," he said coolly, voice devoid of emotion, like greeting an acquaintance. "Friends, if even that." Helen's face showed no trace of having heard him, just a slight nod. Her focus passed him to Karina. It was a clear warning, telling Karina she overstepped. Karina choked back her thoughts and changed the topic. "Didn't you say you couldn't make it back?" Helen gave a small nod, calmly stating, "It took less time than expected, so I came by." Brian raised his eyebrows but said nothing more. Excusing himself, "You guys chat. I've got some stuff to do." Helen didn't respond, standing there like an unyielding pine tree. Brian skirted her to leave, overhearing Helen coldly tell Karina, "Next time, don't involve unrelated people in my business." He paused abruptly. "Unrelated?" Brian smirked bitterly, continuing on. Helen listened as his footsteps faded away. Her face grew dark, chilling the surrounding air. Karina saw through Helen's stubborn pride, sarcastically saying, "Keep being stubborn. When Brian finds someone new, you'll only have regret." Helen unknowingly clenched her fists. Her whole demeanor drooped. Shadows cast over her features, muttering, "Didn't you hear him? He said he doesn't care, so I'm nothing to him." Karina was also at a loss for words. "Fine, have it your way." Frustrated, she walked off but stopped after a few steps. "When I first met you, you weren't like this. Otherwise, I wouldn't have joined your lab. But there's one thing I do understand. Our firm is the only one that can handle the D case domestically, but we're not involved. Since you went against the grain and chose the D firm, don't let personal feelings mix in. Otherwise, you'll regret it someday," Karina said and left. Helen stood there, face cold, feeling unexpectedly tired. She heard abroad that Brian was in charge of this case and rushed back, speeding things up. But for what? Helen rarely found herself silent, overwhelmed but stuck. On the other side, Brian returned to the firm with the contract. He absent-mindedly flipped through the files, but his eyes weren't really focusing. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. It was his assistant. "Brian, someone else came over from Germany. Want to meet them?" Brian slightly frowned, surprised since he hadn't heard about this. Curious but composed, he stood and walked out with her. As he reached the middle of the lobby, he heard a familiar voice. "Hey everyone, I'm your future colleague. My name's Gina." Brian was taken aback. A gentle joy filled his heart, and he chuckled at the woman surrounded by people. Gina heard Brian's voice, turned around quickly, and grinned, dimples showing. Brian snapped back to focus and noticed several male colleagues discreetly checking her out. He smiled helplessly, then said, "Come to my office. Don't just stand here." He turned to lead the way, with Gina quickly following. Behind them, their co-workers watched and whispered, "That girl's into Brian. Huh?" No doubt she followed him all the way from Germany. "Brian's got some serious charm." "Huh?" The assistant cleared his throat, hinting at them to stop. "All right, enough chatting. Let's get back to work." Everyone dispersed, but the assistant also glanced toward Brian's office. Curiosity piqued. Inside the office, Brian made Gina a cup of tea and casually said, "Have some tea, it's pretty good." Gina nodded, sipping, and sincerely said, "Not bad. Only here can you find stuff this good." Brian chuckled, feeling relaxed. He then asked, "Why'd you transfer here? Didn't you just get a promotion in Germany?" Gina set her cup down, fingers tracing the rim. "Didn't you say I could come here? Were you joking?" Brian was taken aback, recalling he had casually mentioned it before he left, never expecting Gina to take him seriously. What a misunderstanding. Brian sighed, asking, "What about your parents? They're okay with you coming back? Didn't you say they were old and didn't want more changes?" Gina nodded, calm eyes meeting his. "They didn't mind, just asked I visit home and send some photos." Brian relaxed a bit at that. He casually asked, "Need help with the hometown visit?" Gina eagerly nodded, "Definitely. I can't find it without you." Brian chuckled again. "Where's your hometown anyway?" Gina thought, pulling an old photo from her pocket. 303 Happiness Street. Brian froze, nearly dropping the teacup. Shocked, he asked, "Say that again? Where?" Gina repeated clearly, 303 Happiness Street. Brian was stunned and replied, "You know where I grew up?" Gina shook her head. Brian laughed, "I lived at 302 Happiness Street." Gina's eyes widened with surprise and a hint of disappointment. "Too bad I moved abroad at 1 and forgot everything. Maybe we met as kids." Brian nodded thoughtfully. "Could be, but I was only 3 then. Don't remember you either." Gina huffed and shrugged it off. "All right, I'll leave that to you. We have bigger stuff to do now." She raised an amused brow. Brian asked, "Like what?" Gina got excited. "After work, take me to eat something delicious." Brian paused, caught off guard by her bright smile, and found himself smiling too. "All right, after work, we'll go." At 6 sharp, Gina appeared at the office door, not rushing him, just waiting with an expectant look. Brian couldn't bear to keep working late. Logging off, he left on time. "Let's go get some roast duck." Eager to show off the local cuisine, Brian took her to a famous restaurant. He was going to book a private room, but Gina insisted on sitting in the main area. Brian didn't mind, though he was used to private rooms with Helen to avoid the noise. But he loved the buzz and company, matching Gina's vibe. After ordering, Gina seemed unsatisfied. Too bad it's just us. I'd order everything on the menu. Brian watched her with a grin and promised, no worries. I'll bring you back. Gina's eyes sparkled. Really? As if not believing him, she asked with a bit of doubt, don't just say it lightly this time. I'll take it seriously. Brian, surprised by how sharp she was, nodded earnestly, really, as long as I'm free. Gina smiled happily just as the food arrived. They happily started sharing the food. Gina must really love good food since she ate every dish completely clean. Brian, who brought her there, couldn't help but smile seeing her enjoy it so much. He found it weird, but being around Gina just made him feel relaxed. Whether they were abroad or at home, Brian enjoyed being around her. After they were full, Brian suddenly stood up and said, I'll go settle the bill. Gina didn't make a fuss, waved him off, then rubbed her stomach and said with a laugh, you go ahead. I need to rest a bit. Brian looked at her exaggerated gesture and gave a helpless smile, heading off on his own to pay. Once done, he returned to their spot but didn't see Gina. He took out his phone and realized she had gone to the restroom, so he sat back down to wait. Waiting for someone? A familiar voice came from above. Brian looked up and saw it was Helen and Karina. They seemed to be discussing a contract. Brian's instincts kicked in. Helen couldn't possibly be considering changing partners because of him, could she? Helen immediately knew what he was thinking, and therefore her face turned serious. It's just a regular dinner, don't overthink it. Brian let out an "oh," feeling a bit embarrassed. He stood up to leave, saying, if there's nothing else, I'll go. Helen felt a surge of indescribable agitation inside her, especially after seeing that the dishes on the table were clearly for two people. Her anxiety peaked. In a moment of unclear reasoning, she grabbed Brian's hand. After we've run into each other, there's nothing you want to say to me? Brian was taken aback for a second, then quickly collected himself and said with a cold face, didn't I already say it? Helen, losing patience, for once showed her emotions openly. Just saying long time no see counts as chatting? Brian immediately frowned, visibly displeased. There's nothing more to say. I don't feel there's any extra conversation needed between us since you're an ex. Seeing Helen's face become stiff, Brian remembered they were at least partners now and softened his tone a bit as he added, except for work. Meaning beyond work, there was no need for further conversations between them. Helen understood what he meant. Her face darkened, tightening her grip but left speechless. This situation wasn't ideal for talking. Their tension had attracted quite a bit of attention. Karina sighed and reminded her, someone's waiting. Helen snapped back to reality, loosening her grip, noticing deep red marks imprinted on her palm. Whatever, she said coldly, then planned to leave when she noticed a woman walking straight to Brian. Speaking in German, I'm ready, let's go. She glanced at Helen and curiously asked, someone you know? Brian replied indifferently, just an acquaintance. Let's go. Then he moved to leave with her. Helen couldn't understand German, but she wasn't blind. She could see the closeness between Brian and the woman. Suddenly, she remembered what Karina said the other day. How are you sure Brian hasn't started dating someone else now? In that moment, hormones chose for her. Helen firmly grabbed Brian's hand and asked, who is she? Brian was taken aback while Gina frowned and forcefully removed Helen's hand. If you have something to say it without getting physical. Helen was surprised. Brian was really annoyed, whispered to Gina, let me handle this, and looked coldly at Helen. What's your problem? Helen wanted to ask herself the same question, but her mind was a mess, preventing her from vocalizing any questions. Karina, after watching this unfold for a while, chipped in, is she your girlfriend from abroad? She had said it offhandedly before, but it turned out to be true. Brian instinctively wanted to deny it but didn't, facing Helen's intense gaze. For some reason, he lied, yes. Gina paused, looking at him with a complicated expression, staying quiet. But Helen, upon hearing the yes, seemed shattered. Her eyes filled with disbelief, bloodshot with a choked voice. You have a girlfriend? Brian was puzzled by her questioning tone, let out a sarcastic laugh, and asked back, Helen, don't tell me you think I have a duty to be celibate for you after our breakup? Helen was hit hard by his words, like being knocked out cold. She opened her mouth but only tasted bitterness. You? Enough. Brian shot her an annoyed glance. It's been 3 years. You can date Jason and I can't? With that, he took Gina's hand and turned, leaving right in front of her. Helen stood there for a while. Her heart felt punctured, in painful anguish. Her face becoming increasingly pale, about to faint. Karina, noticing, patted her shoulder sympathetically. It's over. Maybe you should both move on. Then she headed back inside first. She didn't say much. Knowing Helen's character, she would soon come to terms with it. Sure enough, Helen quickly suppressed her emotions. Only her eyes stayed bloodshot red. But she stubbornly looked in the direction Brian had left, an unspeakable stubbornness arising. Meanwhile, Brian held Gina's hand out of the restaurant, his mind in chaos, so he didn't realize he was still holding her hand until they reached the underground parking lot and then let go. Gina's heart skipped a beat when he released his hold. Neither spoke for a moment in the car. Brian hesitated on how to start the conversation, and Gina didn't want to disrupt the peaceful atmosphere. Suddenly, Brian pressed his lips together, looked earnestly at Gina. Sorry for using you earlier. Gina pretended not to understand. Brian was caught off guard. Hearing her feign ignorance, he wasn't sure what he felt. He just sighed. If you didn't catch it, then let's leave it here for now. He awkwardly avoided the topic. Arriving at her dorm, he felt slightly amused. Back in Germany, you brought me to the dorms. Now we're home, and I'm bringing you. Quite the coincidence. Gina chuckled, continuing his thought. Yeah, fate. Want to come up for some wine? Brian shook his head. I'm driving. How would I get home after drinking? Gina almost invited him to stay over but remembered her tiny single room and bed. Stopped herself. All right, I'm heading up then. See you tomorrow, she said to Brian. He nodded but noticed she hadn't left, turned and met her bright eyes. Suddenly, his heart felt nudged, surrendered with a little smile, saying, see you tomorrow. Satisfied, Gina finally stepped out, quickly heading upstairs. Brian felt he had just given a girlfriend a ride home, laughed softly, and drove away. Once Gina shut the door behind her, her expression turned sober, as the feeling from Brian's presence vanished completely. She fetched a bottle of red wine from the fridge, poured herself a glass, and staggered to the window. Gina had just sipped some wine when her phone rang. She picked up with a cool tone. Hello? If Brian were here, he'd recognize the voice as his former boss in Germany. Gina, are you settling in? Your sudden decision puzzled me. How should I explain to your mom that you're chasing a guy? Have you lost it? Gina chuckled dryly, playing coy. Say whatever you like. Just as long as you're not afraid she'll storm over and ask what's going on between Brian and me. There's a silence on the other end, seemingly stunned by Gina's audacity. After a long pause, I hazily asked, so, did you catch her? Gina remembered the woman who had suddenly appeared today. Her gaze turned sharp. Still chasing. Oh right. Can you look someone up for me? Her name's Helen. I need every bit of information on her. Don't leave anything out. Brian finally made it home. After taking a shower, all he wanted was to hit the bed and fall asleep. But Helen's calls came in, one after another, like a nagging alarm. Frowning, Brian hung up on each one. Seeing she was persistent, he irritably blocked her number. Finally, the world went quiet. But then, just 5 minutes later, his phone rang again. Annoyed, Brian was about to answer and give them a piece of his mind when he saw it was his boss calling. He stopped himself just in time and instead said calmly, "What's up? Calling me at this hour? Did something go wrong with a contract?" To his surprise, his boss said, "Helen is our client. Why did you block her?" Brian froze. An unspoken frustration spread inside him. Well, after 3 years, Helen learned to pull rank. Naturally, Brian couldn't tell his boss about his past with Helen, so he just gritted his teeth and replied, "Okay, got it. I'll unblock her right now." Satisfied, the boss hung up. As if she got the memo, Helen's call came through again. No matter how unwilling he was, Brian had no choice but to pick up. "Helen, what is it you want? Can you just get to the point?" Helen's tone was casual, without a hint of threat, yet her words left no room for refusal. "Break up with your girlfriend." Brian heard this and was simply amused. "Helen, you've been bugging me just to say that?" "Yes," Helen answered without hesitation. With a cold laugh, Brian responded, "Let me tell you, it's not happening. I wasn't planning to rile you up with Gina, but hearing your demand, it's like you're dragging my sanity across the floor. I've been together with my girlfriend for 3 years. Things are stable. Maybe we'll get married someday. Can you stop meddling in my business?" Helen's breathing became heavy, as if she was forcefully suppressing something. "When you left saying I was with Jason, what did that even mean?" Her topic change was quick, as if she came up with an excuse to avoid the mention of marriage. Brian's expression turned cold. "Nothing. I stepped aside so you could be with your first love." Helen's voice rose sharply. "After we broke up, I was never with another man. Unlike you?" She didn't finish her sentence, but Brian could easily guess the point. He smirked. Maybe the post from Jason was intentional, and perhaps the woman's hand in the photo was photoshopped. But whatever their current situation, Helen had no reason to lie about it now. So what difference did it make? Whether she was with Jason or not didn't matter. 3 years ago, he made his decision, and there'd be no going back. "Got it," Brian replied tersely and stated plainly, "I repeat, Helen, we're done. Whoever you choose to be with now has nothing to do with me. Let's not contact each other outside of work. That's it, I'm hanging up." He hung up swiftly. With those words out, the weight in his chest seemed to lighten a bit. But then, the phone buzzed with a new message from Helen. Brian figured Helen, annoyed with him, had sent a harsh word or two. Yet when he unlocked it, he saw a message that was quietly pleading. "You're just dating, not married anyway." Brian was utterly floored. He read the message several times, not believing Helen had sent it. Her point was obvious. She wanted to get back together. Even a fool could see what she meant, but seeing that just made it creepier. Back when he was with her, he'd never felt her so eager. Breaking up and asking to get back together? That wasn't something she'd do. Brian's expression shifted again and again. Ultimately, he chose to reply with nothing, and quietly blocked her number again. She might have lost her mind in a moment of heat, but he hadn't. Those 10 years of chasing had drained all his energy. Getting back together? He'd have to be insane to consider it again. Helen sat on her sofa, feeling restless. It had been half an hour since she sent that tentative message of reconciliation. But her phone remained silent without a single reply. Helen thought to herself, even if he suddenly took a shower, he should be done by now. Holding her breath, she sent another message. But the chat box showed a glaring red exclamation mark. Brian had blocked her yet again. Helen's heart plummeted and shattered. She stared blankly ahead. There was nothing in the air, yet it felt like someone was there. In the 3 years since her breakup with Brian, she often felt there was someone with her in the air. She knew very well she was sick, yet she feared getting help because she was afraid this person would vanish from her world. At this moment, she pictured Brian in his familiar warm yellow pajamas, sitting there, working on his laptop and occasionally glancing at her. "Why do you keep looking at me?" Helen never used to ask because she was accustomed to ignoring his lovingly gazes. But now she wanted to ask, "Brian, do you still love me?" Yet when she did, there was only the sound of her own breathing in the vast room. Brian's shadow vanished, leaving nothing behind. In the end, Helen closed her eyes in humiliation, her heart filled with desolation. The next day, Brian went to the office, planning to keep pushing the case forward, but his boss called him into the office instead. Something suddenly went wrong at the lab, and they said the delivery time had to be pushed back. The boss looked at him hesitantly and said, "Go check what's going on over there. This case can't be delayed. If they need anything, cooperate as much as you can." Although the boss said it like that, his eyes clearly said to cooperate no matter what it takes. Brian clenched his fist, feeling a bit powerless inside. He didn't even know what Helen was thinking right now, but he couldn't avoid talking to her about work. Brian sighed and agreed, all right, I'll visit them myself. After leaving the office, he went back to his desk, expressionless, pulled up the old file, made a few tweaks, and printed a new version. Holding the freshly printed contract, he grabbed the coat on his chair and headed out. It was deep autumn. It was chilly outside. By the time Brian got to Helen's lab, his face was slightly pale. He rarely came here. 3 years had passed and most of the employees had already changed. So now everyone saw him just as a D-firm employee, not the professor's ex. Until a girl accidentally saw him and blurted out with a look of disgust, "Brian, how do you still have the nerve to come see Helen?" Brian gave a cold laugh, recognizing her as a longtime lab member who knew about him and Helen. He wondered why she suddenly had such hostility toward him. Just like that, Brian was curious too. After the girl's question dropped, the air around them froze instantly. People started giving Brian curious glances, like he had done something wrong. Brian stayed calm, but made a mental note to figure out the deal here. Luckily, Helen came out quickly. When she saw him, her face lit up with an unmistakable hint of joy. Brian raised an eyebrow, a bit surprised. Seeing Helen, the crowd scattered. They went into Helen's office, one after the other. Brian took a moment to look around and found this room, where Helen spent 12 hours a day, strangely minimal. A bookshelf lined the wall, filled with books. From physics to math, many books showed signs of frequent reading. Brian glanced back at Helen, getting straight to the point without wasting any words. "Helen, haven't you always wanted to talk? I'm here. So, after we talk, can we get back to the contract?" Helen was pleased Brian came to find her, but her face fell at his words, bringing a bit of awkwardness to the room. The reason Brian was reluctant to talk to her was this. She was always cold. When she was happy, she talked more. When she wasn't, she was so cold it affected everyone else. It was a form of subtle control, though she probably didn't even realize it. "Do you hate me that much? Is there nothing else to say besides work? Like the real reason you left for abroad?" Helen hinted, pain flickering in her eyes. Brian frowned, knowing if he didn't clear this up, it would never end. "Fine, I'll tell you." He adjusted his coat, speaking frankly, "When I broke up with you, it was because Jason had returned." Helen's eyes widened in disbelief. "But I heard it was because you wanted a promotion." Brian let out a sharp, bitter laugh, his eyes so cold they could sting. "So, you believed that?" One line, and Helen was at a loss for words. She had believed it. With Jason's history, she assumed she was being abandoned by another boyfriend. Brian took a deep breath, his expression growing colder. "Helen, remember, I promised I'd always be there for you, didn't I?" Helen went stiff, eventually nodding awkwardly after a long pause. Only then did Brian continue, "I promised, and wouldn't leave you for a promotion. I don't know where you heard such nonsense, and I honestly don't care. What matters is you believed it. That's the result." He suddenly remembered an odd message from his old boss. "Helen will come to Germany to find you." Seeing that message at the time, he believed it, too. He even imagined if Helen followed him to Germany, how long he'd hold out against her pursuit. But she never came. Turned out, she believed someone else's lies, thinking he betrayed her. Brian nearly laughed out loud, his eyes nearly tearing up. Finally, Helen realized that Jason had tricked her. Her hands balled into tight fists, but her heart kept sinking. Brian hadn't betrayed her. He really was heartbroken by her, so he went abroad. So, did she still have a chance to start over with him? Nervously anxious, she faced the truth that came 3 years too late. It suffocated her, like a giant weight pinning her heart, impossible to escape or endure. With a cold look on his face, Brian handed over the file. "If you think the original contract benefits you too little, I have a new one here. We can go down a point more, no further." His tone was strictly business, devoid of any other emotion. Helen's heart was torn apart, filled with regret. "If I had come to Germany back then, would you have forgiven me?" Brian's hand tightened around the file, but his face remained blank. "No. The moment you kept pushing me away because of Jason, the future was gone. The unwavering rejection left Helen pale as a sheet. Suddenly, she looked weak. The usual carefree person now seemed broken. She blankly stared at the contract. She signed it with a shaking hand and handed it back to him. Brian took it, flipping to the last page of the contract. The words there aren't Helen's name. They say, "Forgive me." Brian closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Then he opened them, his gaze icy cold. "What do you mean by that? If you're not willing, don't sign. Save me the waste of a few pieces of A4 paper." The sarcasm fell on Helen's ears, but it seemed to lose its sting. She was silent for a bit and then just said, "Let's proceed as per the original contract. I don't need you giving in." Brian fell silent too. After a while, he asked, "Will you guys stick to the agreement?" Helen nodded, looking pretty defeated. Brian couldn't stand how she looked, as if her disappointment was all his fault. She was the one who got tangled up with Jason first, but everyone seemed to think he was the one who dumped her. Inside, Brian felt irritated. He grabbed the discarded documents and headed right out. At the door, he paused. Looking back at her, he said, "I hope next time I run into your colleagues, they don't look at me as if I'm some heartless jerk. If it's all a misunderstanding, do me a favor and clear it up soon. My reputation matters too." With that, he turned and left without a second thought. Helen took a few deep breaths, then composed herself and pressed the intercom. Full staff meeting in half an hour. Not a single person should be missing. After leaving the lab, Brian texted his boss saying, "It's resolved." He closed his phone and didn't think about work anymore. At that moment, he felt a bit bitter. He thought that by going to Helen's office and clearing everything up, he wouldn't feel so bad. But he didn't expect that throughout these 3 years, all Helen felt was resentment towards him. Their misunderstanding was there from the start, but neither of them tried to clear it up. He loved Helen but didn't know how to open her heart. He believed if he could just be a little more humble, hang on a little longer, he could win her over. Yet, he never considered if she actually needed his kind of devotion. Maybe from the beginning, she was just having fun with him. And now, perhaps she's just used to him and ended up choosing him for that reason alone. Not out of love, but habit. Brian's expression turned indifferent, but his phone suddenly started vibrating fiercely in his hand. A single word flashed on the screen, "Gina." Brian's heart raced again. He didn't know how to handle this call. Hesitating, he picked up. "What's up?" Gina didn't know what he'd been through just now. She chuckled and said, "What's up? It's after work, so I'm obviously asking if you want to hang out." "Oh, that's what it was." Brian sighed. Today had been overwhelming, and all he wanted was to have a drink and blow off some steam. Without overthinking, he replied, "Nah, let's do it another time." Gina paused for a moment but agreed cheerfully without probing further. Brian simply acknowledged her and hung up. He quickly messaged Richard an address. "Nightfall Bar. Be there." Helen was dragged to a bar by Karina as soon as she left the lab. Helen usually disliked crowded places, but when Karina said, "Don't you want to vent a little?" convinced her. Once inside the bar, she already started feeling a bit of regret. People on the dance floor were wildly shaking their heads, lost in the music. Helen picked up a drink and began downing them, not to vent but to get drunk. But before she could get drunk, she heard her name. Freezing for a moment, she turned her head and saw Brian. He was in a stylish jacket, laughing with Richard, mockingly talking about her. No doubt they were cursing her. After hearing about today's events, Richard slapped the table, startling everyone nearby. "Helen has the nerve to ask you to reconcile? Hasn't she hurt you enough? You've wasted 10 years on her. How many decades does a person have, huh? What gives Helen the right to treat you like this?" Richard gritted his teeth. She should know what it's like to have unfulfilled desires. That's karma. Brian chuckled softly. Helen's well known in the physics world with a big lab. What you said she can't have, she probably won't experience in her lifetime. Helen quietly listened, then tilted her head back, swallowing another drink. It was bitter as hell. Brian didn't care what was on the table, drinking one after another. These drinks were sweet, hardly seemed strong. But he forgot a lot of those sweet-tasting drinks were custom-made and pretty strong. So, It didn't take long before Brian got wasted. He mumbled, "Actually, it's not Helen's fault." Helen suddenly froze. Unconsciously, she tightened her grip on her glass, inching closer to where he was. Brian, unaware she was right behind him, spoke honestly. From her perspective, I probably look no different from some jerk who suddenly abandoned her. If I came home one day to find the place emptied and my girlfriend dumping me via a breakup text, I'd be upset too, even if I didn't love her. Helen mentally tried to make excuses for herself. "No, I really love you." But no one heard her. Brian downed another drink, slightly out of it. "But tell me, what's going on in Helen's head? Why couldn't she see me when I loved her? And now that I don't love her, she's suddenly chasing me. Does she have some peculiar tastes?" Helen nearly choked on her drink, almost suffocating in the bar. She hadn't thought her inconsistency would lead Brian to assume something so far off. Her face flushed red, then turned dark, in a whirlwind of emotions. Richard laughed for a bit, slung an arm over his shoulder, giving him a knowing look. "Why are you still curious about her? Can't let her go?" Helen held her breath, her eyes instinctively glued to Brian's face. "What the hell are you saying? The one person I can't ever reconcile with in this world is her." Helen. Though Brian was drunk, when it came to harsh words they just kept flowing. "She deserves to be alone forever, spending her life with lab equipment." Helen looked deeply at Brian, then lowered her head to hide the endless sorrow in her eyes. She absent-mindedly swirled her wine glass, her striking appearance catching the attention of several men around her, until a man, confident in his looks, walked over to her first. "Can I get your WeChat?" The man adjusted his tie, perfectly positioning his face in the bar's light. Without even raising her head, Helen said, "No." The man's expression changed, and he was about to say something. Karina quickly chimed in, "It's fine. Even if she doesn't add you, I will." Same thing. With an awkward smile, the guy exchanged contacts with Karina and quickly made his escape. Karina finally took a good look at her, noticing all the empty wine bottles at her side. Her eyebrows shot up. "Helen, I wasn't paying attention for a second. And you've managed to drink this much? Are you even planning to go to work tomorrow?" Her voice was so loud that several nearby tables glanced over. Brian and Richard were no exception. Helen froze, feeling Brian's gaze on her like fire, almost burning. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her courage to look in Brian's direction once more, only to find he was gone. A sudden hole formed in her heart, leaking all sorts of emotions. "I'm a bit drunk. Heading home. You staying or coming with me?" Helen said hoarsely. Karina, chatting with another guy, responded regretfully, Go. If I had known bars were this boring for you, I'd have brought someone else." Helen didn't argue, quietly following Karina out. Desperately, she scanned the bar, hoping to catch a glimpse of Brian or Richard. Finally, at the entrance, she saw Richard trying to hail a cab across the street and Brian, swaying drunkenly by the door, clearly wasted. Unable to stop herself, Helen approached him just as he leaned back, resting against her. Mistaking her for Richard, Brian closed his eyes and mumbled, "Let's go back. Helen's here at the bar. We need to escape before she catches us." Helen let out a bitter laugh. Even drunk, he wanted to escape her. Was she really that unbearable to him? Richard returned, frustrated at finding no ride, only to see his friend, who swore off seeing Helen, now leaning on her, seemingly happy in her embrace after all. Richard's mouth dropped, but instead of letting go, Helen unknowingly tightened her grip. "Got a car?" Helen asked. Richard shook his head. "Too many people here, no cabs." Helen just nodded, pulling Brian closer, trying to stop his wandering hands. Richard was impressed at how calm she appeared while Brian behaved this way. Only Helen knew just how hard it was to keep the fire she'd been suppressing for 3 years from flaring up at that moment. Controlling her desire, she pulled out her phone. "Couldn't get a cab? Let's take my car. I'll get a driver now." Richard hesitated, questioning, "Is that okay?" Just as he spoke, Brian hugged Helen tightly, whining, "Why'd you take so long? I've been waiting at the bar." Everyone froze at his words. Karina and Richard were awkwardly silent while Helen was simply stunned. Without a word, she just held him tighter. Seeing this, Richard shook his head and said nothing more. True to her word, the driver arrived quickly. The four of them got into the car, with Karina in the front seat and the three of them crammed in the back. Once seated, Brian acted up again, cuddling into Helen. "My head hurts. Helen, did you know?" Helen settled him, gently patting his back. Despite her nerves, her actions were tender. "Hang in there. Okay? There are hangover pills at home. Once we're back, I'll give them to you." Brian nodded obediently, closing his eyes with a frown. Richard couldn't help himself. "Brian's not going back with you. Let's find a hotel instead." Helen disagreed. Someone needed to watch a drunk person. Otherwise, there's a risk of choking from vomiting. Richard froze at this reminder. "But you guys broke up," he started. Moving slightly, Helen disturbed Brian. "Don't move, Helen. I'm uncomfortable." Richard cursed inwardly but knew there was no choice. Brian, when drunk, seemed to only have thoughts of Helen. Still denying his feelings, they were a perfect match, two stubborn people together. Richard sighed, relenting. "Fine, drop me at my place first. I'm lightheaded." Helen agreed. The driver dropped Karina and Richard off before taking them home. With Brian hanging on to her, Helen slowly made her way to their shared home. 3 years without him hadn't changed anything. Not a single piece of furniture was replaced. Even the sticky notes lost their stickiness and had to be glued back. As the door opened, she leaned down, planting a soft kiss on his cheek, whispering, "Brian, we're home." Brian, not quite coherent, caught a faint home. The familiar scent washed over him, and he practically melted, curling around Helen like a vine. "Helen, I'm dizzy." Just the one sentence nearly toppled Helen's restraint. Breathing heavily, her arms shook yet she refused to let go. She didn't know if Brian would scold her when he sobered up, but she just wanted to care for him, like he once did for her. So, she laid Brian down on the bed. In that moment, all the things he'd rambled about started floating back in her mind. This person had tormented her every day during his 3-year absence. Helen couldn't help herself and planted another kiss. Her breath brushed against Brian's face, and she was just about to kiss his lips when he instinctively frowned. Like a flash of light, it snapped her back to reality. Helen quickly sat on the edge of the bed, breathing heavily, but keeping her distance. She stared at Brian for a long time before softly saying, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry for ignoring you when we were together. I'm sorry for not understanding my feelings, falling for you and yet fooling myself by bringing other men in front of you. I'm sorry for everything I did. Sorry for the hurtful words. This might be the last time I get to be this close to you, and maybe we'll never meet again. Yet, I still want to say I'm sorry." Helen bolted out of there, murmuring her deepest feelings. She, a person who could stay calm in the face of the world falling apart, ended up with teary eyes and left the room. The room was deathly silent, except for Brian, sleeping on the bed, with a single tear sliding down his cheek. The next morning, Brian woke up with a throbbing headache, glanced around, and jumped out of bed. This is Helen's bedroom. It was also the room he'd slept in for 5 years. Brian rubbed his head but couldn't recall anything from the previous night. He just remembered going to a bar with Richard, drinking, then the two of them venting about Helen. What happened after that? How did he end up at Helen's place? Brian instinctively checked his clothes. They were intact, and he let out a sigh of relief. He cautiously opened the door and saw Helen, huddled on the couch with her long limbs. She looked uncomfortable, as if she didn't sleep well. Brian stood and watched her for a few moments, then went back to the bedroom to grab a thin blanket. He had worried that the blanket wouldn't be in the same place after 3 years, but when he opened the drawer, it was just as he remembered. And there were the familiar sticky notes. Brian froze. He stared blankly at the somewhat faded sticky notes from 3 years ago, right where he'd left them. A wave of nostalgia overwhelmed him. After some time, he picked up the blanket and gently covered Helen. She didn't wake up, but there was a faint smell of alcohol. Brian instinctively wanted to leave, but she suddenly grabbed his wrist. "Don't go. His heart skipped a beat, thinking Helen had awoken. But when he looked down, she was clearly still asleep, frowning but firmly holding his wrist. Mumbling in her sleep, she kept saying, "Don't go." There was no way Brian could just leave her like that. Besides, her grip was too tight for him to easily pull away. So he leaned in and whispered, "I won't go. Can you let go?" Helen's body tensed. Then she seemed to hear him and hesitantly let go. Brian's heart warmed, and with a sigh, he went to the kitchen. There, he saw the same sticky notes he'd placed back then. If the one in the bedroom was just a coincidence, all these definitely weren't. Helen hadn't removed a single one. Tears welled up in Brian's eyes. He glanced at the couch where Helen lay, unsure of what he felt inside. Suddenly, her phone rang. Helen frowned in her sleep. Brian quickly moved to her side, answering the call without looking. "Hello?" he whispered. "Could you keep it down?" Helen's still asleep. The person on the other end paused, then let out a mocking laugh. Realizing something was off, Brian looked at the phone and froze. It was Jason calling. Brian didn't expect a call from him at that time and remembered what he'd just said, causing his face to heat up. "That's not what I—" "Brian," Jason interrupted, his voice calm. "Congrats on finally being with Helen." Brian was speechless, his words caught in his throat. Unfazed, Jason continued, "The post from 3 years ago was fake. A picture I doctored. Helen called me so many times last night. Is she really that worried you'd misunderstand? I didn't think you liked her that much. Isn't it a bit late to ask now?" The truth was laid bare between them. An ugly, suffocating truth. It hadn't been this way between them before. At first, Brian and Jason were the best of pals. They'd share secrets, take walks together, gossip, watch movies. When did things change? It started when Brian's attention turned to Helen. The three became close friends. People often said Helen and Jason were meant to be, making Brian feel insecure. Especially after gathering the courage to tell Jason he liked Helen, only to see Jason holding Helen's hand the very next day. It felt like the end of the world. Before that, Jason and Helen were close, but not romantically, at least not obviously so. Why did Jason suddenly fall for Helen? Brian wondered and decided to ask. He knew this could be their last conversation. He wanted to solve this 8-year-old mystery. Jason was silent for a while, then let out a harsh laugh and dropped a bombshell. "Because I was jealous of you, Brian." When Jason first met Brian, he was the favorite child in their families. Meanwhile, despite Jason's hard work, all he ever got was, "He's smart but doesn't know how to socialize. Might be hard for him to marry in the future." That's when it hit him. As a boy, no matter how well he did academically, he'd never outshine Brian and his sweet-talking nature. He'd been envious right from the start. Jason forced himself to play with Brian, even though he thought Brian's interests were childish. But he felt it was worth enduring to learn from Brian's strengths. The more time he spent around Brian, the more jealous he got. Why could Brian play with both boys and girls so freely? Why did Brian's parents buy him whatever he wanted if he just whined a little? Why didn't people criticize Brian harshly even when he made mistakes? Why did Jason feel like he always lost to him? Looking back, his jealousy blinded him. When he heard Brian confess he loved Helen, Jason irrationally approached her. "You're smart. There's nobody more suitable for you than me. I can support you in your career, and I don't care if you love me back. Our families and social circles are similar." Helen was flipping through a math book at the time. Jason recognized it as graduate-level material. "So, what are you trying to say?" Jason's words got stuck in his throat. He managed to utter, "Let's be together." Maybe Helen was kinda strange too. Jason thought she'd reject him, but unexpectedly, she agreed. "All right, from now on, we're boyfriend and girlfriend. Hopefully, you can live up to what you say." Jason stared blankly at Helen. Her eyes showed no love at all, yet she seemed so gentle. Too gentle, it felt fake. He got everything he wanted but was never happy. So he ran away. When Helen came looking for him, it was the first time he truly felt relaxed. "Didn't you say you'd marry me after graduation?" Jason looked at the woman in front of him, unsure in his heart. Did he love Helen? Probably, since she perfectly fit his criteria for an ideal partner. Didn't love her? Then why did he take her away from Brian? Thinking this, he blurted out, "Helen, you know Brian likes you, right?" He saw emotions flash in Helen's eyes. Surprise, shock, even some fear. Jason suddenly understood everything. He wasn't the only one slow to realize. "Go back, Brian's waiting for you." So Helen obediently returned. Months later, he saw a post from Brian with a picture of him holding hands with Helen. They were together. Jason's heart twisted. The jealousy he had suppressed came blazing back. For 5 years, he watched Brian like a madman. When Brian was happy, Jason felt miserable. If Brian posted pictures of trips with Helen, Jason would go to the same places. He remembered everything Brian did for Helen. 5 years later, when he returned to the country and saw Brian again, he noticed a hint of pain in Brian's eyes when he was with Helen. He felt satisfaction from it. Though heartbroken, Jason deliberately said, "Brian, long time no see." From that moment, he decided he was going to take Helen back from Brian. But things didn't go as Jason planned. After 5 years with Brian, Helen became uncertain. She couldn't differentiate between love and suitability. Even when Jason tried twisting Helen's feelings and brought up their past, she didn't leave Brian for him. Jason thought he had failed. Unexpectedly, Brian went abroad himself. When Jason found out, he laughed and cried like a madman. He remembered the announcement photo of Brian holding hands and photoshopped his own hand in. He hesitated for 3 days before posting it, visible only to Brian. As soon as he hit confirm, Jason broke down. He felt like the most disgusting person ever. So he ran away again, retreated into his shell, and tried to forget everything. Until a sudden call from Helen. "Jason, why'd you post that photo?" Brian misunderstood our relationship. The worry in her voice wasn't fake. Helen realized her real feelings for Brian. This long-delayed truth finally dawned on her. Jason coldly replied, "Oh, so what? I did it on purpose." Then he hung up. As Helen's calls kept coming, he chuckled and turned off his phone. He buried himself under the blankets and slept the whole day. When he woke again, he hesitated and powered his phone back on. A flood of missed calls and texts from Helen popped up. Most asked why he did what he did and urged him to explain everything. Jason intended to call and yell at her, but Brian was the one who answered. Jason's words were simple and cold, like telling someone else's story. Brian, though, felt lost, unsure how to react. Every memory of Jason was fuzzy until his calm voice made things clearer. Back when Brian envied Jason for standing by Helen openly, Jason was jealous of him too. It's ironic how everyone chases after the unique qualities in others, yet forgets how exceptional they themselves are. Brian closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a calm acceptance within. "I will never forgive you," he said. Jason, on the other end, just scoffed, "Whatever. But I still need to tell you, I used to be jealous of you." When Brian's words reached Jason, it hit him like a storm. He was dumbfounded, clutching his phone tightly. Even after Brian hung up, he couldn't immediately process it. It took him a while, but he eventually laughed, a realization dawning on him. In his laughter, there was relief, guilt, and regret, but not the yearning or stubbornness anymore. In that moment, he finally made peace with the past. Brian hung up the phone and looked at Helen. His eyebrows furrowed, eyes full of complexity. Helen only became aware when the sun was high in the sky. She suddenly woke up and rushed to the bedroom, only to find it tidied up with just one person missing. A wave of disappointment swept over her. She trudged to the kitchen, thinking to get some cold water because drinking always gave her a headache. But in the neat kitchen, there was a small bowl sitting there. She walked over and immediately recognized it as Brian's hangover tea. At that moment, she was overwhelmed with sadness. While making that tea, Brian wasn't thinking about anything. It was only after he finished that he realized what he had done. Leaving Helen's place hastily, his heart was still racing. It had been an intense night. So many unresolved issues dissolved, bringing him peace of mind. Maybe between people, the only thing missing is a willingness to speak openly. Brian sighed, not overthinking, and headed home. Just as he was about to take out his keys, he saw a woman squatting by his door. Gina. Brian froze in place. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice rough. Gina stood up shakily, her eyes bloodshot, her whole demeanor different from the Gina he once knew. Have you and Helen gotten back together? Brian was taken aback. He didn't say much, just took out his keys and opened the door. Let's talk inside. Gina sensed a potential problem, but couldn't resist Brian's invitation. She went in and saw Brian sitting on the couch, worn out but with a serious look. She felt the urge to back away. I suddenly don't want to know. Let's talk some other time. As she took a step to leave, Brian stopped her. Sit down. His expression didn't change, but his tone was chillingly indifferent. Gina froze, sitting down reluctantly. Were you investigating me? Faced with Brian's cold gaze, she couldn't lie yes. Brian took a deep breath, then asked, why were you investigating me? Gina lowered her head, her voice heavy. Because I like you. Brian scoffed. Liking someone means you can investigate them? Liking someone means you can lie? Gina was left speechless by his questions. Brian closed his eyes, trying to suppress the annoyance building up inside him. Is there anything else you're not telling me? If you manage to find out where I live, you're clearly not just some random worker like you said. Gina froze for a moment but eventually chose to confess truthfully. The owner of D Agency is my uncle. I joined D Agency just to gain some internship experience. Brian scoffed. It all made sense now. He knew there was something off. Gina didn't come across as someone from a typical middle-class family. She'd fooled him well. Gina, I can't trust you anymore. Brian's eyes were complicated, but his voice was firm. You know I can't stand deception. If you had been honest from the start, maybe we could have just been friends. But no, you chose to meet me under false pretenses. Sorry, I can't accept this. Gina's face turned pale. I can explain, she said. My uncle told me not to reveal my identity. He was worried I'd be treated differently. Her voice trailed off, as if even she knew something was off. Brian's head was pounding. He stood up quickly and nudged her towards the door. Just go. Let me think this through on my own. Gina didn't dare argue. She exited quietly but whispered at the door. Sorry, Brian, it wasn't intentional. Brian couldn't hear her. He was exhausted, drained by the people around him. After shooting off a sick leave text, he collapsed into bed and fell asleep in seconds. A sharp knock on the door woke him. He stumbled out of bed and opened the door to find Helen holding a bouquet and a disheveled-looking Gina who clearly hadn't gone home. The two glared at each other, eyes full of rivalry. He could get why Gina acted childishly, but Helen getting involved too was unexpected. Seeing the door open, Helen thrust the flowers forward and spoke sincerely. Brian, I know I messed up a lot and hurt you. I'm sorry. I really am. You can curse at me, hate me, but I won't give up. Even if you have a girlfriend now, I'm willing to fight for love. Brian's eyes widened, and he rushed to cover her mouth. Gina was startled and hurried to pry his hand away. How can you put your hand on her mouth? That's gross. Helen, visibly annoyed, almost stuffed the flowers into Gina's mouth. What does it matter to you? If Brian wants to be close, that's his choice. The noise from the two made Brian's headache flare up again. He gritted his teeth. Both of you. Get out. Helen and Gina's faces fell, and they quickly adjusted to calmer expressions. We're just kidding. We get along just fine, actually. Yeah, really good. Brian couldn't help but laugh, feeling the tension inside him start to ease. He wasn't sure if he was giving up or feeling something else, but suddenly he didn't want to sweat the small stuff anymore. Maybe being friends wouldn't be so bad. Who knows what the future holds? Let's start over. Brian smiled, looking ahead at one of them. As friends. He quickly added, watching as her face lit up with unexpected joy. Okay, as friends. She finally smiled back, tears glistening in her eyes. Who says friends can't become lovers in the end?